Whispers of gold, the spark that ignited a nation. 1848, a shimmer in a California stream changed the fate of a continent. What if America's greatest discovery wasn't an accident, but a spark lit by design? In the quiet foothills of California's Sierra Nevada, a man named James Marshall bent over a wooden channel one January morning and spotted something glinting beneath the water. A flash, small, fragile, almost unreal. It was gold. That single shimmer would soon ignite one of the greatest human migrations in history. But what if the discovery at Sutter Mill wasn't just a lucky accident? What if it was the opening act of a much larger plan, one that powerful men had been waiting to exploit, one that would change the very destiny of the United States? This is the story of how a handful of gold dust transformed a frontier into an empire, and how whispers of greed and opportunity reshaped the American dream forever. The morning that changed the world. On January 24th, 1848, James Wilson Marshall was just another carpenter. High when those in Washington began to see the secret leaks. Despite Sutter's efforts, news of the discovery spread like wildfire. The first sparks came from Samuel Brannan, a shrewd storekeeper and newspaperman in San Francisco. After confirming the find, Brannan ran through the streets shouting, "Gold! Gold from the American River!" But before he did that, he made sure his own stores were stocked to the roof with picks, shovels, and pans. Within months, Brannan became California's first millionaire, not by mining, but by selling the tools of the dream. Soon, the secret was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. Newspapers from New York to London printed headlines promising riches for the taking. Ships filled with desperate men set sail from every corner of the globe. The world had caught gold. The lawless frontier. Chaos incarnate. Without established law or government, the miners ruled themselves through crude miners' courts and vigilante justice. Disputes over claims were settled with fists, guns, or rope. San Francisco burned to the ground 6 times in 5 years. Bands of bandits like the infamous Joaquin Murrieta roamed the hills, part outlaw, part folk hero. Murrieta's story became legend, a Mexican prospector wronged and driven to vengeance against the American miners who killed his family. In the shadow of the gold camps, the line between hero and villain blurred completely. It wasn't just a race for gold. It was a fight for survival in a land where greed was law. The Golden Transformation. By 1852, California was no longer a wild frontier. It was a phenomenon. San Francisco had become a booming port city of over 35,000 people, with newspapers, banks, and opera houses rising where tents once stood. The influx of wealth spurred industries that would define the next century: shipping, agriculture, and manufacturing. The gold rush also accelerated America's expansion westward, leading to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the iron artery that would connect oceans and solidify U.S. dominance from coast to coast. But for all the prosperity it created, the gold rush also revealed something far darker about the American soul. That ambition, when mixed with greed, could turn progress into plunder. The aftermath: gold to power. By the 1860s, the easily accessible gold was gone. The miners who stayed behind were no longer dreamers. They were workers for corporations that now controlled massive, industrialized mines. The same merchants, bankers, and speculators who had profited in 1849 evolved into the first Western dynasties. Their fortunes funded railroads, banks, and universities. Their descendants, like the Hearsts, Stanfords, and Huntingtons, would later shape American politics, education, and media. The gold rush was over, but the golden power it created lived on, embedded in the foundations of American capitalism. The legacy of a whisper. The story of the gold rush is often told as one of triumph and discovery, a symbol of the American dream. But beneath the romance lies a haunting truth. The dream began with a whisper, and that whisper carried both promise and peril. James Marshall died penniless, haunted by the discovery that should have made him rich. John Sutter lost everything: his land, his mill, and his fortune to the very people the gold had drawn. The gold they found built cities, empires, and legacies, but it also unleashed greed, violence, and inequality that still echo through American history. What began as a shimmer in a stream became a mirror for the nation itself, reflecting both its brilliance and its darkness. Even today, the spirit of that whisper endures. The same hunger that drove men across deserts and oceans still drives entrepreneurs, investors, and dreamers. Silicon Valley's rise on California soil is no coincidence. It's the modern echo of 1849, another rush for invisible treasure. Every era has its gold. Every dream has its price. The 49ers and the Empire of Dust. By 1849, California was no longer a frontier, it was a fever dream. They called it gold fever, but by the time the world caught it, California was already burning with it. In 1848, when James W. Marshall's hammer struck a wooden sluice at Sutter's Mill and a few flakes of gold gleamed in the sunlight, no one could have imagined what would come next. Within months, That tiny sparkle ignited one of the greatest human migrations in American and world history. By 1849, the land once ruled by Spanish missions and native tribes had become a chaos of tents, guns, and greed. The gold rush wasn't just about gold, it was about empire. An empire of dust, born from dreams and buried beneath them. The discovery that changed everything. It began quietly, almost absurdly so. On January 24, 1848, Marshall, a carpenter working for John Sutter, noticed glints of metal in the water of the American River. He tested it with lye and fire. It didn't tarnish. It was gold. When word reached San Francisco, people laughed. But within weeks, newspapers from New York to London screamed headlines, "Gold found in California." By the summer of 1848, ships abandoned in San Francisco's harbor as crews deserted to head inland. Farmers left their fields. Bakers, lawyers, and even priests vanished overnight. By 1849, nearly 90,000 people, the legendary 49ers, had flooded into California. Some came by sea, others trudged across deserts and mountains, driven by a single belief that fortune waited just beyond the horizon. A world on the move. Imagine it, men from every corner of the world converging on one wild, untamed land. Americans from the East, Irish escaping famine, Chinese laborers seeking hope, and Latin American adventurers, all marching toward a single obsession. Ships packed with Argonauts, as they called themselves, left Boston, New Orleans, and Liverpool. Some sailed around Cape Horn, a 6-month voyage of starvation and scurvy. Others risked cholera crossing the Isthmus of Panama. Thousands died before even seeing the Golden Hills. Yet more kept coming. California's population exploded from 14,000 to over 200,000 in just 2 years. San Francisco transformed from a sleepy port into a roaring city of gamblers, merchants, and thieves. Its muddy streets were lined with tents, saloons, and opium dens. Fortune was the only law, and even that changed by the hour. The Empire of Dust. The truth was harsh. For every man who struck it rich, hundreds found nothing but ruin. The rivers were choked with mud and the corpses of mules. Sluice boxes overflowed not with gold, but with broken hopes. Prospectors slept under tarps, ate rancid bacon, and drank river water thick with mercury from their own tools. Diseases, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, claimed thousands. Still, the digging never stopped, because sometimes someone did strike gold. One man could pull $2,000 in a day, while another starved beside him. And that was enough to keep the fever burning. But the gold wasn't just buried in the ground, it was buried in commerce. Levi Strauss, a Bavarian immigrant, saw miners tearing their clothes to rags and began stitching sturdy pants from tent canvas. They called them waist overalls. Today, blue jeans. Samuel Brannan, a Mormon shopkeeper, bought every pick, pan, and shovel in San Francisco before spreading the news of the gold strike. He became California's first millionaire, not by mining, but by selling tools to miners. The real gold rush wasn't underground. It was in supply, speculation, and manipulation. California became the laboratory for a new American idea, that wealth was not inherited or granted, it was seized. Lawless gold. The gold rush birthed not just fortunes, but anarchy. There were no courts, no sheriffs, and often no mercy. Vigilante justice ruled the camps. Miners' meetings could end in hangings. Gambling halls doubled as morgues. A wrong glance could cost a life. Native Americans who had lived on the land for millennia were driven out or massacred. Some tribes, like the Miwok and Maidu, saw their populations collapse by over 80% within a decade, killed by disease, displacement, and violence. Chinese miners faced brutal taxes and mob attacks, yet kept coming, driven by the myth of Gumsan, the Golden Mountain. The dream of gold united the desperate, but divided the world. The empire that arose wasn't of kings or borders, but of human hunger itself. From gold to statehood. By 1850, California had transformed beyond recognition. From muddy camps sprang towns like Sacramento, Stockton, and San Francisco, built overnight, burned down, and rebuilt again. In just 2 years, California was admitted as the 31st state of the Union, bypassing the usual territorial process entirely. The reason was clear: gold. America could not afford to leave its richest new frontier unclaimed. The gold rush financed the banks of New York, fueled the expansion of the railroads, and gave rise to the myth of the self-made American. The dream that a poor man could become rich by sheer willpower was born here, in the dust and chaos of 1849. But beneath the glitter lay the cost: shattered landscapes, broken lives, and a legacy of greed that shaped the West forever. The fall of the dream. By the mid-1850s, the rivers ran dry of easy gold. Hydraulic mining, the brutal blasting of hillsides with water cannons, turned mountains into wastelands and rivers into sludge. Whole valleys were drowned in toxic mud. The empire was crumbling, but its echo remained. The towns built by miners became cities. The wealth they dug, or dreamed of digging, built railroads, banks, and empires that would stretch across the continent. Many 49ers went home empty-handed. Some never went home at all. They lay buried beneath the same hills they had torn open, their dreams washed away by rain and time. Legacy of the Empire of Dust. And yet, from that madness came a nation reborn. The gold rush accelerated America's march westward, linking oceans, igniting industries, and rewriting the meaning of success. It was the first global economic event driven by media, myth, and mania, a forerunner of every boom and bust that would follow, from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. The gold rush ended in the 1850s, but the dream that began there, the hunger to strike it rich, to reinvent oneself, to conquer the impossible, still defines the American West. Shadows behind the shovels, the real gold barons. While miners toiled in rivers, others mined in silence, from offices and banks. What if the real gold rush wasn't fought with pickaxes, but with paper? What if the true kings of California's golden empire never touched the dirt because they owned it? Behind every muddy camp and glittering nugget, there was another kind of rush, one not driven by sweat and desperation, but by influence, land deeds, and political power. This is the story of the hidden architects of the gold rush, the men who turned other people's dreams into their own empires. The illusion of fortune. When James Marshall found gold in 1848, it set off a frenzy that pulled tens of thousands into California's wild heart. From the Sierra Nevada to the muddy streets of San Francisco, miners swung their shovels in feverish hope. But while they dug through riverbeds and died of hunger, a quieter, more calculated rush began. The real wealth wasn't in the flakes of gold, but in who controlled the land where it was found, the roads that led to it, and the banks that financed it. By 1850, the world's attention was on California's rivers. but in Sacramento's offices, in San Francisco's counting houses, and in Washington's smoke-filled rooms, a small circle of men was already writing laws, buying claims, and building monopolies that would outlast the gold itself. The bankers of Boomtown. San Francisco in 1850 was chaos, a city of tents, mud, and madness. Yet out of that chaos rose a new kind of power, the banker barons. One name stood above the rest, William Tecumseh Sherman, not yet the Civil War general, but banker managing Lucas, Turner & Co. Sherman's bank became one of the first to handle miners' gold. He saw firsthand how fortune flowed, not from shovels, but from ledgers. Other men followed. Darius Ogden Mills, a sharp-eyed financier from New York, established the Bank of California. He understood that miners might find gold, but banks kept it. Mills invested in shipping, railroads, and land speculation, quietly turning a wild boomtown into an organized empire. By the time miners were fighting over gravel and water rights, Mills and his partners were lending money to the very companies that supplied them, owned the freight routes, and controlled the ore refiners. Every pickaxe swung in the Sierras echoed profit in the marble halls of San Francisco. Then came the men who would quite literally lay the tracks for their fortunes. The gold rush had created an insatiable hunger for supplies, for transport, for connection. California was cut off from the East, and whoever could bridge that gap would own the future. Enter the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. Long after the first gold veins had dried up, these men used the wealth of California's early boom to fund their next conquest, the Central Pacific Railroad. With subsidies and insider land deals, they laid the tracks that would unite California with the rest of the nation. The miners who once dug gold now laid rails, and every mile built meant more power for the Big Four, men whose fortunes were rooted in the same gold that had driven others to ruin. The irony? By the 1870s, California's richest men no longer cared about gold. They mined movement, the movement of people, goods, and capital. The railroad, not the river, became the new vein of wealth. The press as power. But empires need more than money. They need control of minds. Enter William Randolph Hearst's father, George Hearst, a former miner turned mogul. George began like any 49er, panning in streams, but he was no ordinary prospector. He had an eye for geology and an instinct for opportunity. While others chased luck, Hearst bought claims that looked worthless and struck veins of unimaginable wealth. His investments in the Comstock Lode of Nevada and later in the Homestake Mine of South Dakota made him one of the richest men in America. But Hearst didn't just mine the earth. His son, William Randolph Hearst, would later mine information. The family's fortune from gold would fund one of the most powerful newspaper empires in history. From metal to media, the Hearst legacy became the blueprint for controlling not just wealth, but narrative. The gold rush had created not only millionaires, but dynasties. Land, law, and manipulation. In 1851, the U.S. Congress passed the Land Act, meant to clarify land ownership in California. On paper, it protected claims. In practice, it handed power to speculators and lawyers who understood how to manipulate it. Powerful interests, some tied to the railroad men, others to Eastern investors, began quietly buying up disputed claims. Miners who thought they owned their plots suddenly found themselves trespassers on their own ground. Government agents and surveyors became brokers of fortune. A single signature could shift ownership of thousands of acres. By 1860, less than 5% of California's population controlled nearly 90% of its private land. The gold rush had promised freedom and equality. Instead, it birthed an oligarchy. The silent fortune builders. Among the most cunning was Levi Strauss, who saw a need not in gold, but in those chasing it. Strauss arrived in San Francisco with rolls of tough canvas and began sewing durable pants for miners. The blue jeans he sold became a global symbol of American grit, but his real genius was understanding the psychology of the rush. While others dug for gold, Strauss built a brand that would outlive every claim in the Sierras. His empire wasn't made of dust, it was stitched from desperation. Likewise, Henry Wells and William Fargo, two former freight forwarders, saw chaos as opportunity. In 1852, they founded Wells Fargo & Co., providing secure transport for gold and mail. The company's famous stagecoaches became the veins of California's financial body, carrying wealth safely through a land that had none. They weren't digging rivers, they were digging trust. Collapse and consequence. By the 1860s, the easy gold was gone. The miners who had once flooded the hills now drifted away. Many broken, some bitter, few rich. But the quiet empire that had grown in their shadow only expanded. The Bank of California controlled Western finance. The Big Four ruled transportation. Wells Fargo dominated logistics, and the Hearsts shaped what America believed about itself. The gold that had once glittered in pans now flowed through bank vaults, rail contracts, and newspaper columns. California's power had shifted from the desperate to the deliberate. The real barons of the gold rush weren't those who found gold. They were those who found a system to control it. Legacy of the Hidden Kings. When historians speak of the gold rush, they tell of fortune seekers and broken dreams. But the deeper story is one of transformation. The gold rush didn't just fill pockets, it built the foundation of American capitalism. The lessons learned in California became the DNA of the nation's business empires. The control of supply chains, the manipulation of land and law, the use of media to shape desire, the conversion of chaos into opportunity. By the dawn of the 20th century, the old mines were silent, but the shadow empire thrived in banks, railroads, and boardrooms. Today, Silicon Valley stands on that same soil, driven by the same fever, the idea that with the right leverage, a dream can turn into a dynasty. The tools have changed, but the hunger remains eternal. The miners of 1849 swung their shovels for gold. Their masters, hidden behind desks and deeds, mined something far more valuable: power itself. And that is the true story of the gold rush, not of men chasing fortune, but of fortunes chasing men. Fortune, greed's dark frontier. As fortunes grew, so did the bodies buried beneath them. What if the California gold rush, the symbol of hope, freedom, and the American dream, was really built on blood? What if the story of shining nuggets and booming towns hides another story of murder, stolen lands, and entire nations erased beneath the hills? History celebrates the courage of the 49ers, but behind their shovels and songs lies a truth America seldom tells. The gold rush was not only a race for fortune, it was a war for land, power, and survival. This is the dark frontier of greed, the side of the gold rush written not in gold, but in blood. The fever begins. In January 1848, when James Marshall found gold at Sutter Mills, California was still a wild, quiet land, home to around 150,000 Native Americans, a few thousand Mexicans, and a scattering of settlers. Within 2 years, that silence vanished. By 1850, nearly 100,000 fortune seekers had poured into California. Miners, adventurers, gamblers, and criminals from every corner of the globe. Ships clogged the San Francisco harbor, their crews having deserted to seek gold. Camps like Coloma, Hangtown, and Angels Camp became instant towns, rivers of humanity flowing through rivers of mud. But where gold glittered, morality faded. The rush wasn't just a search for treasure, it was an unchained human hunger. And in the frenzy to claim land and fortune, California became the most lawless place on earth. The first to fall. Before the first miner swung a pickaxe, the land already belonged to someone else. California's native peoples, the Miwok, Maidu, Yana, and others, had lived for thousands of years in balance with the land's rivers and forests. The gold discovered beneath their feet turned their world into a nightmare. Miners flooded their villages, cut down their forests, and poisoned their waters with mercury and silt. The salmon runs that fed entire tribes vanished in a single season. But worse was yet to come. State militias, fueled by gold and hate, launched violent campaigns against native tribes. The California state legislature even authorized bounties for native scalps, $1 to $5 for every head. Between 1848 and 1870, California's native population fell from 150,000 to barely 30,000. Historians today call it what it was, genocide, funded by gold. Behind every mine was a massacre. Behind every fortune, a grave. The war for claims. If the land was soaked with blood, it was also soaked with greed. The rush was supposed to be a free-for-all. Anyone could stake a claim. But without law and order, might made right. Disputes over goldfields turned into gunfights. At Rich Bar, 2 miners fought over a single nugget. Both ended up dead. In Coloma, a mob hanged 3 Chilean miners on suspicion of theft, without a trial. At Mokelme Hill, hundreds of foreign miners, French, Mexican, Chinese, were driven out at gunpoint by Americans shouting, "California for Americans." The gold rush became a crucible of violence, fueled by nationalism and racism. Vigilante committees became judge, jury, and executioner. San Francisco's 1851 Vigilance Committee alone hanged over a dozen men, often on rumor alone. Law existed only for those who could afford it. Justice came from the barrel of a Colt revolver. The Foreign Miners Tax. In 1850, California passed one of its most infamous laws, the Foreign Miners Tax. It required non-American miners, especially Chinese, Mexicans, and Chileans, to pay $20 a month, nearly a miner's full wage, simply to dig for gold. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. The law gave local sheriffs and vigilantes license to harass, beat, and rob foreigners. Many paid with their lives. Entire communities of Latin American miners were driven from the camps. The Chinese, who had come believing in Gum San, the gold mountain, were instead met with fire, fists, and lynchings. And still they came. Despite hatred and murder, thousands of Chinese miners continued to work the abandoned claims that white miners had left behind, often turning small fortunes from the scraps others ignored. Their quiet resilience became one of the gold rush's forgotten triumphs and one of its most tragic ironies. The shadow of Sutter. Even the man who started it all, John Sutter, became a victim of the chaos he unleashed. When gold was found on his land, Sutter's dream of building an agricultural empire collapsed. His workers deserted, his property was overrun, and his mills were stripped for parts. he lost everything, not through war, but through greed. It was the perfect symbol of the gold rush. No matter how it began, greed always consumed itself. Women, brothels, and broken promises. Amid the men and violence, women's stories too became part of this blood-soaked frontier. Most women who came west were not miners' wives. They were workers, laundresses, entertainers, and sometimes prostitutes. In San Francisco, by 1851, there were nearly 500 brothels, many run by women who had found no other means to survive. Yet even here, fortune and horror intertwined. Madame Atoy, a Chinese immigrant, became one of the city's most powerful figures, owning multiple brothels and taking white men to court for abuse. But for every Atoy, there were hundreds of trafficked women, especially Chinese and native girls, sold into forced labor and prostitution. The gold rush was not just a story of men's greed. It was built on women's suffering. Hydraulic hell. By the late 1850s, the easy gold was gone. Desperation gave birth to destruction. Miners turned to hydraulic mining, blasting entire hillsides with powerful jets of water to strip away earth and expose hidden gold veins. The results were apocalyptic. Rivers turned to sludge, valleys filled with silt, and farmland for miles downstream was buried beneath toxic waste. The Yuba River ran thick with mercury, a poison that still pollutes California's water today, over 170 years later. The pursuit of fortune had turned nature itself into a casualty of war. Justice in the shadows. Every boom births its reckoning. In 1884, after decades of destruction, a farmer named Edward Woodruff sued the mining companies for flooding his land. The resulting case, Woodruff versus North Bloomfield Mining Company, became one of America's first great environmental trials. The judge's verdict was stunning. Hydraulic mining was declared illegal. For the first time, greed had met its limit. But for many, the judgment came too late. The rivers were dead, the hills scarred, and the people who once called California home were ghosts. The gold rush was over. Its legacy, blood, fortune, and ruin, remained. The hidden cost of gold. When the dust settled, California had changed forever. The gold rush brought the state into the Union, fueled the nation's economy, and forged the myth of the self-made man. But it also wiped out cultures, poisoned ecosystems, and normalized violence as a tool of progress. The true cost of gold was not measured in ounces, but in lives. For every man who struck it rich, hundreds died nameless. For every town that rose, 10 fell to ashes. Behind the glittering myths of opportunity stood the reality of conquest. And yet that myth endures, shining bright as the metal that created it. Because America has always been haunted by the same hunger, the belief that fortune can justify anything. The hills of California still bear the scars, but if you listen closely to the wind that howls through the canyons, you might still hear the ghosts of the 49ers, the pickaxes, the gunshots, the cries for mercy, echoing through the empire of dust they left behind. From gold to power, the rise of the Western dynasty. The gold may have vanished, but its power endured. What if the gold rush never truly ended? What if the glittering gold pulled from California's rivers didn't just vanish into history, but transformed into something far more lasting? Power. By the time the last pickaxes fell silent and the mining camps turned to ghost towns, a new kind of empire had risen. The gold rush had minted not only fortunes, it had forged dynasties. Families, financiers, and corporations who took the raw chaos of 1849 and turned it into the machinery that would power America's future. Its railroads, banks, industries, and politics. This is the untold story of how gold turned into influence and how a handful of men in the West became the architects of modern America. The alchemy of wealth. When James Marshall's rush, what he built instead was one of the most powerful institutions in the American West. Ralston's partner, Darius Ogden Mills, had already made his fortune lending to miners and buying their failed claims. Together, they turned the gold dust of prospectors into solid capital, building shipping companies, financing railroads, and controlling entire mining regions through loans and mortgages. The Bant of California became the West's first real financial empire. When gold prices shifted, they shifted politics. When railroads needed funding, they decided which routes would live or die. By the time miners realized their gold had been replaced with paper, the dynasty had already begun. From miners to moguls, the Hearst transformation. Among those who rose from the dirt to the throne was a miner named George Hearst. He arrived in California with nothing more than a pick and a gambler's instinct, but he possessed what few others did: vision. Hearst wasn't looking for gold dust, he wanted ore. He studied geology, learned the language of rock, and began buying claims others thought worthless. One of them, near Nevada's Virginia City, became the legendary Comstock Lode, one of the richest silver mines in American history. By the 1870s, Hearst had stakes in some of the most profitable mines in the world: the Homestake Mine in South Dakota, the Ophir Mine in Nevada, and the Anaconda Copper Mine in Montana. His empire stretched from California to the Rockies, a network of mining wealth that fueled banks, railroads, and cities. But Hearst's greatest legacy wasn't metal. It was media. His son, William Randolph Hearst, would transform the family's fortune into a publishing empire, shaping American opinion for half a century. The Hearsts proved that gold could buy something even more enduring than wealth: power over minds. The railroad kings. If the Hearsts mined the mountains, the Big Four conquered the land itself. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, four ambitious merchants from Sacramento, saw what no miner saw coming. The real fortune lay in connecting the mines. They founded the Central Pacific Railroad, backed by massive federal loans and land grants. It was the boldest gamble in American history to lay tracks across the Sierra Nevada and link California to the rest of the Union. Thousands of Chinese laborers carved through granite cliffs and snowbound passes to complete the line. When it met the Union Pacific in Utah in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was born, and with it, the modern United States. But the Big Four's motives weren't patriotic. They used insider deals, inflated contracts, and political manipulation to enrich themselves beyond imagination. By the 1880s, they controlled rail lines, shipping companies, and real estate across the West. Even Leland Stanford became governor of California, and later a U.S. senator. His mansion became a symbol of what the gold rush had truly built: not just wealth, but dynasty. The birth of corporate California. As the 19th century rolled into the 20th, the families and financiers of the gold rush had reshaped California into a new kind of empire, of corporations, banks, and institutions.
Echoes of the conspiracy, the price of the American dream. Every fortune comes with a shadow. What if the American dream was built on a lie? We're told that hard work and ambition forged the nation, that every man who struck gold, laid rail, or built a city did it through grit and opportunity. But beneath that shining legend lies another truth. The American dream was born not in fairness, but in ruthless ambition, deception, and greed disguised as destiny. This is the story of how the gold rush didn't just build the West, it built America's entire mythology. A dream that promised freedom, but demanded a price few could see. The birth of a fever. It began, as all American myths do, with a rumor. In 1848, whispers spread eastward. Gold had been found in California. Within months, the promise of instant fortune ignited a migration unlike anything in human history. Farmers abandoned their fields, sailors jumped ship, and merchants sold everything they owned to head west. They called it gold fever. But it wasn't gold they were chasing. It was a dream. By 1850, over 300,000 people had poured into California, transforming a quiet Mexican frontier into a cauldron of chaos. San Francisco exploded overnight, from a sleepy port into a lawless boomtown where fortunes were made and lost by the sunrise. But even as the miners dug, someone else was digging deeper into the very soul of the American idea. The Great Illusion. The gold rush sold an illusion that anyone could strike rich through hard work. But the truth was colder. Most miners never found more than a few ounces. The real money flowed to the suppliers, the bankers, the speculators. Merchants like Samuel Brannan, a San Francisco shopkeeper, made more in a month than most miners would in a lifetime. Brannan didn't mine gold. He sold picks, pans, and dreams. He became California's first millionaire simply by selling to those who believed they could be. Empires in the dust. While miners toiled in mud and misery, powerful men quietly carved empires from the chaos. Financiers like William Ralston and Darius Ogden Mills founded the Bank of California, transforming raw gold into structured power. They controlled loans, property, and railroads. They turned gold dust into credit, a new form of invisible wealth that outlived every gold strike. But behind their shining banks lay darker dealings. Ralston was accused of manipulating mining shares and orchestrating market crashes to seize control of rival companies. When his schemes collapsed in 1875, he drowned himself in San Francisco Bay, an echo of the madness that had consumed the West. The Forgotten Victims. Every dream has a price, and the price of the American dream was paid in blood and land. Before the first miner arrived, California had been home to over 300,000 Native Americans. Within 2 decades, nearly 90% were gone, driven off their lands, starved by displacement, or murdered in state-sanctioned campaigns. In 1851, the California legislature passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, a cruel misnomer that legalized their enslavement. Indigenous children were sold as apprentices. Entire tribes vanished as mining poisoned rivers with mercury and silt. Even as men shouted freedom and opportunity, others were chained and erased in its name. The gold rush wasn't just a migration, it was an invasion, and its victims were buried beneath the very soil that glittered with promise. The Railroad Conspiracy. By the 1860s, the gold fever had evolved into something larger and far more organized. The gold rush taught America one thing: whoever controlled movement controlled the money. Enter the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. 4 merchants who used their gold rush wealth to found the Central Pacific Railroad, connecting California to the east.
Their project was hailed as a triumph of progress, but behind the golden spike ceremony lay a web of corruption. The Big Four bribed senators, manipulated land grants, and exploited thousands of Chinese laborers under brutal conditions. The paper gold of the future. As the physical gold dwindled, a new kind of gold began to rise: paper gold. The financiers of the late 19th century discovered that the true wealth of the gold rush wasn't metal, it was momentum. The hunger it created became a tool. Banks and corporations turned speculation itself into an industry. By 1890, America had entered the Gilded Age, a period of enormous wealth for the few and crushing poverty for the many. The descendants of the gold rush elite, like the Hearsts and Stanfords, moved from mines to mansions, from pickaxes to politics. They founded universities, newspapers, and trusts. They built cathedrals of culture to cleanse the stains of their fathers' ambition. But the hunger that had driven their rise, the endless chase for more, never died. It simply evolved. The modern echo. Fast forward to the 21st century, and you can still hear the echo. Today's Silicon Valley stands on the same ground that once swarmed with gold miners. The new prospectors no longer dig with shovels, they code with keyboards. The new gold is data, and the new rivers are digital. The same fever still burns, the belief that one idea, one risk, one bold strike can make you rich overnight. And once again, a few rise to unimaginable power, while millions chase the dream in vain. The pattern hasn't changed, it's just become invisible. Behind every innovation, every billionaire, and every self-made success story lies the same question that haunted 1849. Who really pays for the dream? The true price of ambition. The gold rush promised opportunity, but delivered inequality. It offered freedom, but birthed monopoly. It inspired the American dream, but it also defined its limits. In the West, the wealthiest 1% of miners controlled over half the gold by 1855. A century later, the same imbalance echoed in Wall Street skyscrapers. And today, the wealth gap in America mirrors that of the 19th century, proof that the ghosts of greed never left. The American dream was never just about hard work, it was about belief. The belief that success was moral, that ambition was divine, and that failure was a personal flaw, not a systemic one. That belief built cities, industries, and empires, but it also blinded generations to the exploitation beneath it. The dream's shadow. If every fortune casts a shadow, then the gold rush's shadow still stretches across America. It's in the oil booms that scarred the Midwest, the tech rush that reshaped privacy, the financial crashes that shattered families. Each time the same whisper returns, this time it'll be different. But history disagrees. From gold to oil to data, every new frontier revives the same old hunger and the same conspiracies of power that decide who wins and who's left behind. The gold rush didn't just build the West, it built the playbook for American capitalism. And every time we chase a new dream, we are still hearing its echo. The final reckoning. By the early 1900s, the last gold mines had fallen silent, but the spirit of the rush lived on, in boardrooms, in Congress, and in the national psyche. America learned that greed could be packaged as ambition, and ambition could be sold as freedom. That's the real conspiracy, the one no one ever stopped. The American dream was never just a hope, It was a product, and like every product, it had a cost. For every mansion built, a town was forgotten. For every millionaire minted, 100 men went hungry. And for every gold coin struck, a truth was buried. The dream remains, but listen closely and you'll still hear it, the echo of the picks, the cries, and the conspiracies that built America.